forward and talk to you about what happens when Italians come to the United States and why mainly come to the United States. So the big 45 years of migrations are between 1880 and 1924. So it's more than 4 million Italians came to the United States, and that's a conservative estimate.
Here you go.
Graziella, sorry, you just got muted. There you go.
Okay, am I, okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good, very good. So they came to the United States. Why would Italy leave? Why would Italians leave the country? Well, it's the well-known reasons that still dictate migrations for a lot of people. One was economic reasons. So by 1870, Italy is unified and the wars of unification were expensive. So the new king of Italy raises the money through taxation. And therefore taxes go up exponentially, and they're actually taxing poor people quite highly. And therefore the social classes they belong to were challenged, and the people decided to leave and migrate somewhere else. At the time, migration would be to other European countries, Northern Europe in particular, but above all France. My relatives migrated to France and to the United States. And the other reason was that the new king transformed Italy from a colonial space, all fragmented, into some kind of modern nation state, and therefore instituted one important thing for all nations, which is a military branch that would be filled by citizens, not mercenaries like it was before, but citizens, and therefore imposed a military service that lasted for 7 years, which is an enormously long period of time, to which young men had to participate. Now, if you're already poor and you take a young man out of the family, that family is going to slip into a lot more poverty than it was before. The idea of the 7 years was that Italy had to be unified culturally, linguistically. So take these young men out of the place where they grew up, send them in completely different areas of Italy, and do that. So economic reasons. Then there were political reasons. Unified Italy is not a democratic country. So ideas such as socialism and anarchism are actually criminal associations. You would end up in prison, and therefore the idea to move somewhere else to avoid prison was a push for a lot of people that they came to the United States. Now, at the beginning, Italian migration to the United States are marked by a high percentage of return, because that's the main idea for all the migrants in that particular time. A lot of them also remained in the United States, but there were incentives established in the 1920s by Mussolini to bring men back into the country, because the country had to be militarized and therefore soldiers were needed. Why do I say that migrations, a large number of Italians came between 88 and 24, is because there were racially based immigration quotas established in 1924. So privilege where those migrants coming from Northern Europe and the, let me put it in quotation mark, riffraff coming from Southern Europe were to be kept out of the United States. Why is Southern Europe considered such an undesirable area of the world? Well, it is considered as some sort of behind in their process of modernization, and too close to Northern Africa. So a transition area between what is Europe and Africa itself, still not really part of Europe. That's what Italy and the governments in Italy tried to do since the unification, that is to whiten Italians and to modernize them in a way, change the image of Italians. So even if the grand tour to complete the education of a lot of young men and women was also to travel to Italy, what people needed to do in Italy was look at the monuments and the ruins, but certainly not deal with Italians. Italians were definitely undesirable people. So in 1915, the first movie in which the protagonist is an Italian comes out. It's a production from Hollywood. The main actor is not an Italian American, is George Beebam, at the time very famous as an actor. And this movie tells us a lot about what Americans think Italy is and Italian culture is than what it really is. It is a romantic story. There's young men in Naples who wants to marry this young woman. The woman's parents instead want to marry her to an old man because he has money. And so they tell him, if you make money, we will give you our daughter to marry. And it's very interesting, the beginning of this movie, because there is a lot of confusion about what Italy is. So you have images of churches and landscapes that are typical of Zorro movies. You know, those little white churches that appear always in Zorro movies that depict, you know, Southern California, Mexico. That is used also to identify Naples. And then there is this image that, of course, they want to insert an image of Venice, and there is our protagonist that is herding sheep in Venice. Now, who is that demented shepherd that takes sheep to Venice, that is built on water, and there is not even one blade of grass in the whole place? So there is this sort of patchwork of popular images of what they think Italy is. Well, our protagonist, of course, comes to the United States and becomes a shoe shine, of course. And you see an image of him in the larger picture. And then in the smaller poster, you see the father, the young girl, and the older perspective groom for the young girl. So this guy comes to the United States, and of course, he's working for the Irish boss. Right. So when Italians come to the United States, they find another Catholic community that is better established, which is the Irish. And you think, well, two Catholic groups, they're going to get along together. No way, Jose, right? Because Italian Catholicism is extremely theatrical, but also it has incorporated within itself a lot of pagan rites and imagery. And the Irish, with their sort of harsh, strict form of Catholicism, thought that these Italians were just savages. So they would only allow Italians to celebrate their baptism and their masses in the basement of the Irish churches. The Irish came to the United States with their priests, the Italians didn't. The Vatican didn't take care of that. So there was a lot of animosity, but also the Irish came before, and they had time to sort of whiten themselves. All the waves of migrants that came were sort of codified as somewhat non-white. The color of your skin doesn't really matter. Color and race are sort of cultural constructions. So the Irish had managed to whiten themselves, and they had done so through marginal economic improvements to their status, but also because they have taken official roles in the police, in local governments, and therefore their position had changed. And of course, they also had established their gangs and their kind of mafia, which is where Italians learned criminal activities and then founded their own mafia branches, not so much because they came to the United States with already that knowledge. Italians that came to the United States were either extremely poor or extremely politicized. If people were already a member of the mafia in Italy, they already had enough money to live on. There was no reason for them to come to the United States. But we will get to the mafia again. Let's go back to our movie. So our protagonist is working for the Irish boss, and he makes enough money to marry the Italian woman he wanted to marry, and brings her to the United States, and they have a child. Now, I wonder how much the dairy industry paid for this movie, because it turns out that the doctor says that the wife cannot nurse the child because it is unhealthy. We are in 1915. We are at a moment in which modernism, being modern, means choosing processed food. Processed food is the food for modern people. It is the healthy food, and not this food that Italians somehow are bringing that is like too close to nature. It stinks. It's much better for you to eat food that doesn't stink, that is processed, that it's an industrial product. And therefore, this poor Italian, this shoeshine, doesn't have money to buy pasteurized milk for his child, and the child dies. He goes to the Irish boss to ask for additional money, and the boss says, "No way, Jose, I'm not giving you money." So the boy dies. And the Italian man, who you see how he is portrayed, he sort of has this savage appearance. And I don't know if the movie is because it's not being restored, but the skin of this protagonist seems to get darker and darker the longer you watch this movie. I don't know if just because it needs to be restored, but it's very interesting. But it has this savage appearance, and as a savage, he wants revenge. And so he goes to the house of the mafia boss. The mafia boss has a child, this young daughter, who has this very strange disease. If she hears a noise, she will die. I know, this makes sense, but this is the story, the movie. So the Italian goes into her bedroom, and then while he is in almost making a noise to kill her, this girl makes a gesture with her hand that reminds the Italian of his own child, and therefore the protagonist leaves the room and does not kill the child. The end. This is sort of the first sort of patronizing film about Italian Americans that is produced and disseminated in the United States. By the way, the original title is not the Italian. The original title is the Dago. It was turned into the Italian because the Dago was a slur, and therefore they changed the title. So why Dago? Why is it a slur for Italian Americans? Well, two reasons. We don't know exactly what is the origin. It could be from Diego, which, however, is more of a Spanish name. It's quite used in southern Italy, not so much in the north. Or it could be coming from dagger, because Italian men were supposed to be violent. It's part of this profile as being sort of savages, and therefore they had a dagger in their pocket all the time. They were armed all the time. So we don't know where the word dago comes from, but here we are. Here is another image. You see all this Italian that is particularly disheveled. and gestures a lot. This is the wife, and as you notice, she is endowed breast-wise, so there is no reason why she wouldn't have been able to nurse the baby. But there was really this obsession about being modern. And these immigrants coming literally from the soil, from the land, wouldn't qualify and didn't have the money for processed food. So when you talk about Italian Americans, you talk a lot about food. And this movie tells you it's a no-no. Italian American food is a no-no. And when you think of Italian American food, you think of spaghetti and meatballs. This has nothing to do with Italian food. Why? Italian American food is very detached from what you would call Italian food, because the people who came to the United States were poor people. Therefore, their diet was very basic. It was mainly soup or bread and onions, practically. Vegetable soups and bread and onions, no meat whatsoever. Some who had served in the kitchen, who worked in the kitchen of wealthier people, saw what food for rich people was like, and they tried to reproduce it here in the United States. When they came up with spaghetti and meatballs, it had to deal with demonstrated that they had made it, that they could afford meat. And so you see these enormous meatballs that you will not find anywhere in Italy. There is a dish in Naples, and there are some pallets of meat, but they're very small. So Italian American food originated from a desire to demonstrate economic success. It still used ingredients that at times came from Italy or imitated what came from Italy, and ingredients that were extremely unpopular in the United States. In fact, in the 1930s, if you went to an Italian restaurant in the Italian areas of the city, you were slumming. It was slightly dangerous to go and do that. It was daring to eat this food that stank. Italian cheese stank. Italian food has smell, so it was not good to eat that at the time. It was sort of uncivilized at the time. So it was kind of daring of you to eat that. So it's very interesting how much Italian cuisine makes fun of Italian American cuisine, and how much Italian Americans who are used to this diet and then they go to Italy for the first time, they are a little bit disoriented. The food is very different, and priorities are very different. So who are these Italians who come to the United States? Let's have a look at the socialists and the anarchists. We have, among the Italian American community in the 1910s and the 1920s, the largest number of newspapers being produced still in Italian. They are radical newspapers. And the Italian Americans participate in those labor fights that sort of ground our daily life today, which is the fight for a 5-day working week, the fight to regulate child labor, for example, in the teens. These are all fights that Italians participate in together with Jewish immigrants and other immigrant groups to the United States. We are in New England, so imagine northern Massachusetts at the border with New Hampshire. But even within New Hampshire itself, you imagine all those textile industries, for example, they were packed with Italian Americans, and they really participated in all the strikes that contributed to changing dramatically the way that we consider working, and changed dramatically the concept of working class in the United States. Lawrence, Massachusetts had a ton of textile industries. So when the Italians would strike there, they would put their children on the train and they would send them up to Bari, Vermont, another large Italian American community where at the time being stone cutters were not striking. And so the children of the striking Italian Americans, these strikes would last for months, would not starve because the Italian American community in Bari, Vermont would feed them. And when the stone cutters in Bari, Vermont would strike, they would put the children on the train and send them to Lawrence, Massachusetts, so that Italian Americans there would feed them. So who are these anarchists? They are people who came to the United States with a certain amount of education. They were probably in trouble in Italy because of their ideas. And once in the United States, they ran a lot of these newspapers. They also wrote novels, but also they were community organizers. And I'm talking about men, they were mainly men, but also like the Bambace sisters, women who participated in these labor movements of the 19 teens, beginning of the 20th century, the first 20 years of the 20th century. And they end up in trouble because by 1917, the United States are frenziedly fighting the major threat that they felt they had at the time, which was communism. Italian Americans are mainly socialists and anarchists. What does that mean? They belong to the long European tradition of anarchism, but Italian socialism and anarchism was particularly popular in the countryside in Italy. And socialism originates in Italy from anarchism. Andrea Costa was the leader in the 19th century, second half of the 19th century. The leaders of the anarchists in Italy becomes the socialist leader. And Italian and European socialism is particularly interesting because it is a pacifist movement. So if anarchism is a revolutionary movement, that means they believe in violence. That is, they will be the ones putting bombs, even in the United States. Remember the Wall Street bombing, for example. Socialists instead are pacifists. This changes in Europe in World War I when socialists in Europe decide that patriotism has to be favored compared in relation to pacifism, and so they volunteer for the fight and they participate in World War I. Not Italian socialism. Italian socialism will remain a pacifist movement. So they look particularly frightening because they participate in labor movements, but they are very different from the anarchists within the United States. They're Russian anarchists, they're Jewish anarchists, they're Italian anarchists, they're German anarchists. It's not just the Italians who are the anarchists in the United States. But the socialists coming belong to a pacifist movement, and it will never change for Italian socialism. So here are our Italians, and the 1920s come around, and two major things, culturally speaking, happen in the 1920s. The one thing is Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti are arrested in 1920, sentenced to death in 1921. They were anarchists. They were anarchists who maybe, we don't know that, were involved in the bombing of Wall Street, but they were certainly not involved in the murder that they were accused of. But they become some sort of a lightning rod for the fight against radicalism in the 1920s. We are 3 years after the Russian Revolution. People who appear as extremists have to be fought, and these two men some sort of represent this radicalism, this extremism. So sentenced to death in 1921, there are the proofs that are brought for their guilt are really iffy, not really sure. The judge himself is not really certain of what is going on. And by the way, the judge is Judge Thayer of the Thayer family that has donated so much money to Dartmouth College. Where was I saying? Okay, so sentenced to death in 1921, executed in 1927. And the whole world is trying, head of states are trying to prevent this execution, but they were executed in 1920, hung in 1927. This is an important date for Italian Americans because of this fight against these radicals who, however, influenced so much American society and brought such positive changes to the labor laws in the United States. They become more and more figures that are considered negative for American culture and society. And starting from 1927, Italian Americans start to move away from this position as radicals and becoming more and more conservative. Now, there is a large number of Italian Americans who are now members of the Republican Party, and this move toward conservative positions started after the execution, in fact, of Sacco and Vanzetti. But also among migrants sometimes, and this is very common, is happening in France, is happening in Great Britain, it's happening now in Italy with the new migrants, that sometimes voting the way that those people who have exploited you or oppressed you gives you the feeling that if you vote like they do, that you really belong. That in becoming conservative, you were proving at the time the fact that you were becoming American. Another thing in the 1920s, it's such an exciting cultural moment, is the presence of another Italian American who is Rudolf Valentino. Now look at this picture. Rudolf Valentino brought a very different representation of masculinity to a large audience in the United States because of the movies. There is a lot of gender ambiguity in Rudolf Valentino. If you think of the masculine men of the 19th century, you have to think a man with characters, a man that would not allow himself to represent any ambiguity whatsoever. He was the strong, maybe pouchy man a little bit, wearing a jacket, a vest, the watch in his vest pocket, sort of a very traditional form of masculinity, strength, and this image of pater familias, of head of the family, the man who makes decisions. In the 1920s, what becomes much more interesting is not so much character as I have defined it, but personality, that is individuality, originality as one person, not as a man representing a masculinity that is approved and therefore all men aim to embody. And here is Rudolf Valentino, as I said, sexually ambiguous, starts out working as a tango dancer in cafes in New York, where upper middle class women would go to play the tango. Now, I'm saying playing dancing tango, and I'm winking because there was a lot more going on than just dancing tango with Rudolf Valentino for these upper middle class women. He becomes an actor in Hollywood, and he becomes the most beloved actor by American women. So it is very interesting how at this time, this non-white Italian actor represents a masculinity that American women really want to embrace, and is completely hated by American men. because it's a really a revolutionary form of masculinity. So he also does interesting things. For example, he popularizes wearing a wristwatch. Now, if you have a wristwatch where you pretend to wear a wristwatch and you go like this to look at your time, that was considered to be a very effeminate gesture. If you wear a real man, your watch would be in your vest pocket. This is not a manly gesture. And Valentino, that's all he wears. That's the watch that he wears. And he changes this sort of attitude toward men doing things that were not considered the masculine things to do, to the point that American public toilets in the United Machines install puff machines. These were puff machines. You put a little penny in it and it would puff out face powder for men. We in the 1920s. So he had an enormous impact on everyday life, but also on the concept what a man should be vis-a-vis American culture and vis-a-vis migrants as well. This is a migrant man. He came to the United States, the son of a pharmacist, so not for economic reasons, it's just for a sense of adventure. And he ends up in Hollywood. In Hollywood, his identity as really not white is marketed in movies that portray him as Northern African. So here you have Rudolf Valentino in The Son of the Sheik. He was also the Sheik in the other movie called The Sheik, and is always represented as seducing white women who find themselves in the middle of the desert and so on and so forth. So the screen is putting in front of Americans something that is considered some kind of a threat. These non-white migrants that are mating with white women. So at a time in which eugenics are very popular in the United States, here is a man that is perceived as non-white, placed on the screen, that is going against the grain and representing the kind of masculinity the women crave, not the dictator, the softer form of masculinity that he embodies. Of course, he dies in 1926. Why? Because he has acute appendicitis and there is no surgeon who dares to cut into the flesh of Rudolf Valentino. And so they let him die. I hope you're laughing, but yes, that's exactly what happens. And in the end, he dies young and therefore remains this incredible myth in American culture. And what you see here on your right, you see his coffin that is completely submerged with flowers. And on the left, you see the enormous crowds of women who showed up at his funeral. So two very different things and two very different changes that are brought by Italian Americans and Italian American events in the United States. Of course, we can talk for 10 hours about the 1920s and Italian Americans. I'm trying to pick interesting moments of Italian Americans and the way in which they're perceived, but also they're represented. So 1926, Valentino died, and this kind of masculinity sort of goes underground a little bit. It is the time in which a tough masculinity emerges again, even vis-a-vis Italian Americans. And here you see a very young Edward G. Robinson playing Little Caesar. We're not talking about pizza, we're talking about mafia. So this is the movie that then establishes the tradition of thinking of Italian American men as originally, once they arrived in the United States, as violent, and in 1930 as organized as a violent gang, which is the mafia. Of course, it's not an Italian American playing the mafioso in this movie. It's Edward G. Robinson, fantastic actor. And plays this sort of model of Italian American masculinity that still remains. I mean, filmmakers are making still a lot of money in creating these mafia movies based on this representation of Italian American maleness as violent, aggressive. It's not the only type of role that Italian Americans occupy within American society in the 1930s. There are other kinds of scripts that are being produced even in Hollywood. And here you have John Fante, who grew up among Italian Americans in the Colorado. Keep in mind that Italian Americans didn't only come to the big cities of the United States, in New York or Chicago in particular. They are spread all over. That they worked a lot in mining centers, and Colorado was one of them, where they also were bricklayers. His family was a family of bricklayers. You see John Fante worked in Hollywood, wrote scripts in Hollywood, and wrote a number of books that I would highly recommend. They give you the sort of portrayal of the Depression from the point of view of the immigrant, and in its case, the Italian American immigrant. Two famous novels are Wait Until Spring Bandini and As the Dust, and I highly recommend them. What you see in the middle is a movie that was made of As the Dusk. Skip the movie, read the books. There is also a movie of Wait Until Spring Bandini. They're really crap. I'm sorry. I mean, there's no way of saving those movies. So if you're interested, it's a very interesting portrayal of the Depression in the United States. And if you are familiar with Steinbeck and The Grapes of Wrath, these are good books to complement that representation of California. So I would really encourage you to read them. Who else should be on your bookshelves to represent the 1930s and Italian migration of the time? It's Pietro di Donato, Christ in Concrete. This is a novel written by a man who's self-taught. He worked as a bricklayer. Pietro di Donato wrote this book about bricklayers in New York, and it's highly imbued with Marxism and his attempts to combine Catholicism with Marxism. It's an extremely interesting novel that when I teach Italian American culture at Dartmouth, my male students love in particular. I still have not discovered exactly why, but it is quite interesting. It described family culture in New York, in the Italian-American family, where the father dies on a construction site because regulations are being disregarded, and therefore he is buried under a ton of concrete. And so the migrants who get sacrificed, who get killed, is a form of Christ figure that the son will try to honor, and will honor it by, at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, detaching completely from any Catholic or Christian tradition, because that is totally useless for the working man. You know, only teaches the working man to accept its destiny and not to change it. So it's a very interesting book. It's in paperback, very cheap to buy. So if you can, please go ahead. Now, when did Italian Americans really start to define themselves as active members of American society and sort of assimilate at the time? And assimilation was the key word there. We have rejected it now because assimilation demands that you abandon your cultural roots and totally embrace the local root culture of the country, of the destination country. It was pretty much during World War II Italian Americans were interned in 1941 in locations such as Wyoming and Montana. At some point, the presidents of the United States, Roosevelt at the time, said, oh, I don't worry about Italian Americans. They're just a bunch of opera singers. So those camps were closed, and Italian American men were quickly naturalized at the time, and they served more than 1 million, between 750,000 and 1.5 million of Italian men served in the military during World War II. Where were they sent? They were sent mainly to the Pacific. Why? Well, you know why, because if they were sent to Europe, the danger was that they would fight against their own cousins in Europe, and therefore they were sent somewhere else to fight. And there are some interesting texts, and I don't know why I skipped it. Oh, yes, here is the text about Italian Americans in World War II. There are also a couple of books about the internment of Italians during in 1941. Something bizarre happens during World War II. Lucky Luciano is a mafia boss in the United States in the 1930s. And he's called Lucky because he escaped being arrested many, many times until, because of the RICO law, he was sent to prison for tax evasion, not for murdering anybody, but for tax evasion. You know, this has been used over and over again to defeat mafia organizations. So Lucky Luciano is in prison in the 1940s, and the United States are thinking of invading Europe and landing in Sicily. And so they have the bizarre and very wrong idea that they need to have somebody with connections in Sicily. And so they go to prison and ask Lucky Luciano, and they tell him, if you come to Italy with us and you connect us with local people, of course it was the local mafia, and you know the mafia was not doing well under fascism, because if you have a dictatorship, the dictatorship stands on a total control of the country. So if there is too much control, criminal organizations have a hard time flourishing. So and they said, and if you help us, then we let you free in Sicily. You cannot come back to the United States, but you're free in Sicily. And Lucky Luciano, who was not stupid, said, okie dokie, I'm gonna do it. And then, of course, went to Italy with the Americans and landed in Sicily and did exactly what he promised to do. But what he established also by invading Sicily, by remaining in Sicily, was create very close connections between the Sicilian and the American mafia. So facilitated by the American government, here we have this explosion of the roles the mafia will play after World War II, thanks to Lucky Luciano. But what is this mafia? I mean, everybody somehow since 1930 with that film is obsessed about these Italian American men who are mafiosi, or they think everybody is a mafioso. So in 1963, there are hearings, the Valachi hearings. They're called Valacchi in Italian, but here they call it Valachi. It is this guy who gets arrested and decides to spill the beans. He's a member of the Genovese crime family. He's really not a big deal in the family, but he is the first one that talks about the hierarchical structure of the mafia. And what you see in front of you is a representation of what he helps the American authorities to put together as an idea of what the mafia, how the mafia is organized. Now we know that some of this was true, and some of this was what Mr. Valachi invented, because he really wanted to have a good story for the authorities. So it's sort of 70% true and 30% wrong. But this had such an enormous impact on American imagination, A, because the news reported about this, and B, because a guy called Mario Puzo wrote a novel using the information that he learned from the Valachi paper. Mario Puzo was not a member of the mafia. He wrote this novel after writing a number of novels. The novels that he wrote before are very interesting, that they have to deal with the Italian American communities in the United States, but they sold very little. So Mario Puzo, who had a family, was not making enough money to feed this family. And so he said, okay, Americans are sort of obsessed about this Italian American identity as mafia. And therefore, he got the Valachi paper, he worked in a library and put together this incredibly popular novel that was The Godfather. Made a ton of money with it. And of course, he used what Valachi has said, but also invented an enormous amount about the kind of mafia that he wanted represented in his book. What is particularly a sign of enormous success of the book is that the mafia learned from the novel and adopted names after the novel. So they were inspired by the novel to use names for themselves that came out of the novel itself. Who says that a book, a novel has no influence? In this case, it had the influence of changing the way in which the mafiosi themselves saw themselves. So they sort of structure themselves along the lines of the novel itself. That became even more popular. Oh my goodness! Oh no, here it is. Oh, oh wow. Well, you look at it this way in this format. It wouldn't allow me to show in any other format. Became even more popular in 1972, 1973 with the release of The Godfather. Coppola's Godfather, that we have all seen with Godfather 1 and 2, and that terrible, terrible Godfather 3. Don't watch Godfather 3 if you have never watched The Godfather. Watch 1 and 2. Those are the really good ones. This representation of mafia is extremely popular because it represents the mafia as a state within the state, as some sort of an independent entity within the United States, and some kind of threat that could potentially colonize the whole of the United States, and in the early 70s, completely displaces the attention in the entertainment business and in the way that people are receiving these movies from the scandal of Nixon's corruption to another threat, a threat that is represented and glamorized both in the novel and in the film, that sort of replaces and displaces the attention of the American audience toward the mafia, toward this enormous threat that should be fought at all costs, and taking away some of the attention away from the big scandal of the time, which is Nixon. So this movie engenders a ton of other representations of the mafia, but it is time for me to shut up and let you ask questions. And I have run through practically 70 years of Italian American culture, but we can go a little bit more in depth with your questions. I hope that you enjoyed this tour de force across 70 years.
Graziella, do you want to unshare your screen now so we can?
Yes, good idea.
See everybody? So I'll start us off with a question, and we'll give people time to type into the chat, or you can
let's see. I'm not doing a very good job of unsharing.
Oh, let me see if I might be able to do this.
Okay, let me just go do this. Okay.
There we go.
Okay, yes, okay, very good.
So
Very good.
I'll start us off with a question, which is, I think you've talked a lot tonight about how Americans perceive Italian Americans,
Mhm.
but I'm wondering if you could characterize a little bit about Italian American culture for us as well. How do Italian Americans perceive themselves versus what are some of these stereotypes that we've seen?
Well, Italian Americans would, of course, hate all of the stereotypes. It doesn't mean they have not uh, conveniently used them at the time, including using the stereotype of Italian American food as Italian food. Imagine, the money that Italian Americans have made with the restaurants of Italian cuisine that was actually Italian American for a long time. Of course, they're sick and tired of this association between, oh, you're Italian American men, therefore somehow you have some connections to the mafia somehow. So they have, some of them have fought against it in a very constructive way. Imagine all the Italian Americans who are now playing a very important role in politics. Think of Cuomo, Pelosi, the mayor of New York. So they have supplied very different representation of Italian Americans. At the same time, the market, the Hollywood film industry have made so much money out of represented Italian American as mafiosi, and this is not relenting. It's still going on. At the time when there are about 45, I think that's more or less the right figure, different organized, different crimes in the crime organizations in the United States, but it seems that the attention tends to go film-wise to Italian American mafia. So Italian Americans have now are part of the fabric of American society in the United States, but also all over the world. Think the fact that there are 60 million Italians living in Italy, and there are more than 60 million people of Italian origin in the world. So there are millions of ways in which being of some Italian origin is now being embodied in many different ways in outside of Italy, including the United States. For a long time, Italian women, for example, who worked in academia became what could be called crypto-Italians, right? Italian American social mobility was not fueled through education, but rather through economic achievements. And therefore, they were not considered to be the intellectual minority of the United States. That was reserved for the Jews in the United States. So in the 1950s, what you see in 1960, you see Italian women who start getting into academia will take the name very often of their husband that would very often hide their Italian American roots, for example. And then in the 1960s and 70s, the big boom is of Italian American women marrying Jewish men, sort of entering within families that would appreciate women interested in an academic life and an intellectual life. So that went on for quite a long time. So you have a dispersion after World War II of self-interpretation, self-embodiment of what Italian American, being Italian American was. After the war, there is also what appears also Italian women writing about their own origin and their own culture. Helen Barrollini is the biggest name about among them. Her book Umbertina is a tour de force, literally between covers about 100 years of Italian American women. It's a very interesting novel that you can definitely buy. It's another cheap novel that has been recently republished, so it is available. So did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And we're getting a lot of good book recommendations tonight, so I'll put a list together at the end for everybody who's on the call. So we've got a lot of questions in the chat now. Kenneth asks, can you speak about the establishment of Columbus Day?
Okay. Well, what can I say about it? I mean, it's at the center of a big controversy. I think that focusing Italian American celebration on one particular figure that is Columbus, it is really shortchanging the role that Italian Americans have had within American culture. Why pick Columbus? Why pick why go back to the colonial conquest? There were Italian Americans, cowboys in the Wild West. Sirigo is one of them. We do have his story as well. Let's celebrate the role that this guy played in the Midwest. Let's celebrate Madre Cabrini. Let's celebrate this incredibly important Italian figure. Come on, let's celebrate Fiorello LaGuardia. Fiorello LaGuardia cleaned out corruption from New York, from the town hall in New York when he became mayor. Why are we going back to Columbus? Who cares? Let's celebrate those Italian Americans who have had such an enormous positive impact in the last 150 years in created what being Italian American is today in the United States. So let's not shortchange Italian Americans. They've done a lot. Let's forget about Columbus. Let's replace his statue with the statue of all of these other people.
Got a question in the chat from Penelope, who asks, is there still anti-Italian prejudice and how is that changing?
I don't think so. I mean, when I came to the United States, there were some preconceptions. I had the student, I was at the University of Washington, and a student said, oh, you're an Italian woman, but you're not short and fat and all dressed in black. Yeah, no. That was kind of funny for me.
Please describe my whole family.
Yeah, well, you know, there is an Italian comedian who is also an academic. Her last name is Barreca. She makes fun of her uncle or aunts that dress like Ottomans, right? They were the same. They had the same size of them. But you know, I was born in Italy in 1960s. It's a different representation of being Italian Americans. Actually, when I came to the United States was the time when anything Italian was popular. With a lot of confusion between what was Italian American. It was the time I came to the United States in 1980s when everybody wanted to go to Italy on vacation. Italy itself had changed dramatically, right? It was the sixth industrialized country in the world. So I never really encountered any negative stereotype about Italians or Italian Americans. It's a different thing going to places like Germany, for example, in the 1980s and 1990s. The condition of Gastarbeiters of Italian origin there has left a lot of negative connotations about the identity of Italian Americans. I always end up having some troubles as an Italian in Germany, which is always surprises because I'm not used to it any longer. But within the United States, I would say anything that is Italian is popular. Think of food, think of fashion, think of shoes, God almighty, think of shoes. Yeah, absolutely.
So Carolyn asked if you could explain more of your comment that no surgeon wanted to cut into Rudolf Valentino. What did that mean?
Because there was some sort of a metaphysical identity of Rudolf Valentino. He was sort of this perfect statue, this sort of symbol of maleness that was literally adored by women. If a surgeon got it wrong and had cut into this sort of admire flesh of the epitome of maleness, that would have been a disaster. So little. The same thing, surprising enough, happened to Fellini. Fellini, the director, got sick, and they didn't do as much as they could have for him because everybody was terrified of having to intervene on this icon of Italian culture that was adored by everybody. So sometimes being excessively famous and it's counterproductive. You become untouchable, and in the end, they let you die rather than cut your adored flesh in many ways. So it's really bizarre, but that's what happened.
Donna asks, when did the emancipation of women take place in traditional Italian culture?
Well, it depends what you mean by the emancipation of women. Women got the right to vote at the end of World War II. So way after a lot of places, including the United States. However, a lot of laws that still existed in Italy were definitely laws that played against women's independence. For example, the husband would always be the head of the family. So if women wanted to have a passport, they needed the approval of the husband, or the children would be considered legally property of the husband, for example. So they could not appear on the passport of women. So we're talking in legal terms. We have to wait until the 1970s to have two major laws approved in Italy, which is the abortion and divorce law. Until 1970, there is no divorce in Italy. There's legal separation, but there's no divorce. The Christian Democratic Party organized two referendums in order to cancel those laws that were highly defeated. So from the legal point of view, you have changes that take place gradually after World War II. As a feminist, I would say we're not there yet from a cultural point of view, but it's not only Italy. I mean, it is the whole world, I think, including the United States. So things are changing gradually, but there is no linearity in history. There are changes and then regressions and then other changes and then other regressions. So the battle right now is being fought, all over the world about the abortion laws. So we shall see.
We had a few questions about Italian stonecutters and masons in England. One question referred to a community in Vermont. Can you say anything about that?
Yes. The stonecutters community, it was located in Barry, Vermont. These were migrants coming from Lombardy, from the Varese region. So they were not coming from Massa Carrara with the tradition of the Carrara marble, Michelangelo and all the stuff. No. They were coming from Lombardy. So this is one of the signs that tells you that Italian migration is not just from the south of Italy, it's from all over Italy. They worked for a certain number of decades. However, the working conditions were pretty unhealthy. So that first generation died of, is it called silicosis? Sort of a lung disease. And so you don't have a ton of traditions and memories left in Barry, Vermont. They have the statue to the stonecutter right there, and there is a woman who wrote a novel about the stonecutters of Barry, Vermont. And I'm having a senior moment, so I can't remember right now her name or the name of the novel. But if you are patient with me, I will Google a novel about stone cutters, Barry, Vermont. I have a copy of it, but I just can't remember it. Oh, not getting it.
If anybody knows the name. Oh, Judy said Lesser Gods.
No. No. I will send it to Trisha. So no. Oh, wait. No, it's not coming up. It will come back to me at some point. So that's the community right there. The library in Barry, Vermont, and has a certain amount of documentation about the lives of the stonecutters there. But yeah, I know maybe I'm not answering exhaustively, but there is not as much as one would like to have about their stories. Yeah.
So I'm seeing a little bit of debate going back and forth in the chat. Graziella, I don't know if you can see it, but a little bit of debate over Columbus and his politicization. Why?
Grandpa's. Well, that is my position, but also, I work in post-colonial studies, so I would be against any glorification of people who participated actively in colonial campaigns. I know that it became, it was inserted in the curriculum of children in elementary school. If American children knew something about Italians, it would be Columbus. Mm-hmm. And it is understandable how psychologically Italian Americans hang on the figure of Columbus, because when you migrate to a different country, you occupy the margins of that culture. And therefore, if you have a strong figure like Columbus, you can say, oh, you think I am non-white and I'm just a poor, illiterate Italian coming to the United States, but I come from the people who discovered your country, right? I mean, psychologically, I do understand that. And in the 1920s, a lot of Italian Americans even embraced fascism. Why? Because when Mussolini became the dictator, he was actually admired internationally. People looked at him as the guy who would solve all American problems. So he was respected. So me, as an Italian American who is considered, just poor, illiterate bricklayer, or the builder of the subway in New York, or, working with the Chinese migrants in building the railway tracks, putting down the railway tracks across the United States. And then I have one Italian that is admired, I would embrace that Italian as well. I think that in 2020, we need to step away from our emotional relationship with historical figures and really look at what really we want to treasure. And here you have celebrate Marconi. Good. Let's celebrate Puccini. Yes, although as a human being, Puccini was kind of problematic, but it's a great artist. So let's celebrate. Let's think rationally about what is it that we want to defend? What is it that we want to promote? We have a ton of people we want to promote. The other day, my colleague organized a lecture about the impact that Dante and his work had on African American culture. Come on, people, let's be proud of that, right? I mean, let's move away from such a problematic figure that is Columbus, and we have a ton to be proud of. Think of the writers, think of the intellectuals, think of the politicians. I mean, yeah, Think of the scientists. How about a good statue to Fermi? You know, although, yeah, I mean, he contributed to creating the A-bomb, but come on. I mean, I would embrace the figure of, I mean, we have Rita Levi-Montalcini, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1986, and taught at Washington University in St. Louis for a ton of years. Let's embrace her. Let's have a statue to Rita Levi-Montalcini, neuroscientist who won the Nobel Prize for medicine. I mean, yeah. That's my position, and I'm not moving from this one. So yeah, okay.
Well, thank you. We're out of time tonight, but I want to thank you on behalf of New Hampshire Humanities, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. A big round of applause for Dr. Parati for giving us
thank you
and sharing with us. So I want to tell everyone that these programs are brought to you in part with funding by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And if you would like to support our work, you can visit our website, nhhumanities.org/give, for more information. You can sign up for our newsletter, Human Ties, where we send out information about our upcoming programs. We've got more programs coming up in our Black Thought series next week. And after tonight's program, you'll receive an email with a link to take a survey. So we appreciate your feedback, and we thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Graziella, and thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Good night. And I'll put together the book list too, and I'll get that up on our website as well.
Fantastic. And I will come up with the title of that novel. So
someone said, was
that.
it Catherine Patterson, Bread and Roses? Someone said that in the chat.
No.
Okay.
But I will come up with that one.
We'll get the titles and we'll send out the book list.
Yeah. Oh, yes. No, I got it. The person who said Lesser Gods, that person was right. It's a 1949 novel by Mari Tomasi. That's the name I could not remember. Tomasi. Yes. So Mari Tomasi, M-A-R-I, and Tomasi, T-M-O-M-A-S-I. Mari Tomasi, like Lesser Gods.
Okay, I'll get that list for everyone.
Okay. Hey, we did it. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. Bye.